Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we dive into the world's most thought-provoking books one sip at a time. Today, you've chosen a book that marks you as a seeker, someone who looks beyond the surface and is willing to confront the deeper questions of existence. Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche is not just another book. It's a profound journey into the depths of morality, truth, and the human psyche. While the masses might be lost in endless social media scrolls or glued to binge-worthy series, you're here, seeking knowledge and growth, and that's truly commendable. Beyond Good and Evil stands as one of Nietzsche's most influential works, pushing boundaries and challenging conventional morality. Although not directly endorsed by contemporary figures like Bill Gates or Barack Obama, Nietzsche's ideas have undeniably influenced countless philosophers, writers, and thinkers throughout history. His work resonates within the corridors of academia and beyond, inviting readers to question the morality imposed upon them and urging a reclamation of their personal truth. Friedrich Nietzsche, a brilliant yet controversial philosopher, was driven by a quest to deconstruct the moral values of his time. His personal struggles with health and isolation gave him a unique perspective, and his writings reflect a deep, often painful introspection. He wrote Beyond Good and Evil in 1886 as a response to what he saw as the failings of traditional morality, challenging readers to redefine their understanding of concepts like good and evil. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, and someone slides a book across the table that promises to completely upend everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. That's exactly what Friedrich Nietzsche did in 1886 when he published Beyond Good and Evil. And today, as we settle in with our coffee, we're diving into one of the most provocative philosophical works ever written. Now, before we even crack open the main text, Nietzsche gives us this fascinating preface that's like a philosophical appetizer, a taste of the intellectual feast to come. And let me tell you, he doesn't waste any time getting straight to the point. He's essentially saying to his readers, everything you think you know about morality, we need to talk. Think about this for a moment. How often do we actually question the moral beliefs we hold? Most of us walk around with this invisible backpack full of ideas about what's good and what's evil, what's right and what's wrong, and we rarely stop to ask where these ideas came from or whether they're actually serving us well. Nietzsche is like that friend who suddenly asks, "But why do you believe that?" and refuses to accept because that's just how things are as an answer. In his preface, Nietzsche introduces us to what he calls the Prejudices of Philosophers. Now, when he uses the word prejudices, he's not talking about racial or social bias in the way we might think today. He's talking about these unexamined assumptions that even the smartest people carry around like invisible luggage. It's like when you realize you've been pronouncing a word wrong your entire life, and suddenly you wonder what other fundamental things you might have gotten backwards. Nietzsche argues that philosophers throughout history have been like people trying to navigate with a broken compass, thinking they were heading toward truth when they were actually just wandering in circles, guided by cultural assumptions they never bothered to question. He's particularly critical of what he sees as the dogmatic nature of traditional philosophy, where certain moral principles are treated as eternal truths rather than human constructions that evolved for specific reasons. Here's where it gets really interesting for us modern folks. Nietzsche is essentially doing in the philosophical realm what we see happening in every other field today. Think about how we've revolutionized our understanding of health, relationships, work, and success by questioning assumptions that previous generations took for granted. We no longer accept that stress is just part of life, or that you have to choose between family and career, or that certain foods are inherently good or bad. We dig deeper, we ask better questions, and we're willing to challenge conventional wisdom. That's exactly what Nietzsche is proposing we do with morality itself. He's not saying we should become immoral or throw ethics out the window. Instead, he's suggesting we become more thoughtful, more nuanced, more honest about the complexity of human values. It's like the difference between following a recipe blindly and actually understanding why certain ingredients work together. One of the most striking things about this preface is how Nietzsche positions himself as an explorer rather than a teacher. He's not claiming to have all the answers. He's inviting us to join him on a journey of discovery. It's reminiscent of how the best podcasters or YouTubers today don't lecture at you, but rather take you along as they figure things out. There's something refreshingly honest about his approach, something that says, I don't know where this leads, but I know the current path isn't working. Now, think about this in terms of your own life. How many times have you found yourself following moral rules that made sense in one context, but felt completely wrong in another? Maybe you were taught that being honest is always the right thing to do, but then you faced a situation where a small lie would spare someone unnecessary pain. Or perhaps you believed that hard work always leads to success, only to watch talented people struggle while others seem to coast on privilege. Nietzsche is suggesting that these moments of moral confusion aren't bugs in the system, they're features. They're signs that we're dealing with something far more complex and interesting than simple black and white categories. He's preparing us to think in shades of gray, to embrace what he calls the dangerous maybe. The possibility that our most cherished beliefs might be more fragile and contingent than we'd like to admit. What makes this preface particularly relevant today is how it anticipates our current struggles with moral relativism and cultural change. We live in a world where different communities have radically different values, where social media exposes us to dozens of competing moral frameworks every day, where traditional institutions are being questioned and reimagined. Nietzsche saw this coming more than a century ago, and his response wasn't to retreat into fundamentalism or sink into nihilism, but to develop what we might call moral courage, the willingness to think for ourselves while remaining deeply engaged with the human community. The preface also hints at one of Nietzsche's most important insights, that our moral beliefs aren't just abstract principles but living forces that shape who we become. The values we hold don't just guide our actions, they literally create the kind of people we are. This is why examining our moral assumptions isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a form of self-creation, a way of taking responsibility for the kind of human being we're becoming. As we prepare to dive deeper into Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche's preface serves as both warning and invitation. He's warning us that this journey might shake some of our most fundamental beliefs, that we might discover uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. But he's also inviting us into what might be the most important conversation of our lives, the conversation about how we should live, how we should treat each other, and what it means to be truly human in a complex and often contradictory world. So grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. The journey beyond good and evil is about to begin. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching people walk by, and you start to notice something fascinating. Everyone seems so certain about their beliefs, their values, their understanding of right and wrong. But here's what Nietzsche wants us to consider as we dive into the opening section of Beyond Good and Evil. What if the very foundations of how we think about truth, morality, and knowledge are built on assumptions we've never questioned? What if our most cherished philosophical traditions are standing on quicksand? When Nietzsche talks about the prejudices of philosophers, he's not being petty or dismissive. He's doing something far more radical. He's asking us to imagine that some of our greatest thinkers might have been asking the wrong questions entirely. Think about it this way. Imagine you've been trying to solve a puzzle for years, only to discover you've been looking at it upside down the whole time. That's essentially what Nietzsche suggests has happened in philosophy. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Nietzsche argues that philosophers have been obsessed with finding absolute truths, unchanging moral laws, and universal principles. Sounds noble, right? But here's where it gets interesting. He suggests this obsession actually reveals a deep-seated fear, the fear of uncertainty, of change, of the messy complexity of real life. It's like someone who organizes their bookshelf by color rather than subject because it looks neater, even though it makes finding anything practically impossible. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. We see it everywhere, in political debates where people cling to ideological purity, in social media arguments where nuance gets bulldozed by absolute statements, in corporate cultures that worship rigid processes over creative adaptation. We've inherited this philosophical tendency to want clean, simple answers to complex questions, and Nietzsche is pointing out that this might be exactly what's holding us back. Now think about this. When a philosopher claims to have discovered an eternal truth about human nature or morality, what are they really doing? Nietzsche suggests they're often just dressing up their personal experiences, their cultural background, their historical moment in fancy philosophical clothing. It's like someone claiming their grandmother's recipe for apple pie represents the universal essence of dessert, charming, perhaps, but hardly objective truth. This insight becomes particularly powerful when we examine how different cultures approach fundamental questions. What one society considers obviously moral, another finds barbaric. What seems like common sense in one era becomes laughable superstition in the next. Yet philosophers have repeatedly tried to extract universal principles from these shifting sands of human experience. Nietzsche isn't saying this makes philosophy worthless. He's saying it makes it far more interesting and honest when we acknowledge what's really happening. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. Imagine a group of people who have lived their entire lives in a valley surrounded by mountains. Their philosophers develop elaborate theories about the nature of the world based on what they can see. Perhaps they conclude that existence is naturally bounded, that horizons are fundamental features of reality, that the proper way to live involves staying within clear limits. Then one day, someone climbs over the mountains and discovers vast oceans beyond. Were the valley philosophers wrong? Not exactly. They were describing their world accurately, but they mistook their particular perspective for universal truth. This is what Nietzsche sees happening throughout the history of philosophy. Brilliant minds like Plato, Kant, and others weren't deliberately deceiving anyone. They were genuinely trying to make sense of existence. But they often failed to recognize how their own backgrounds, personalities, and historical moments shaped their supposedly objective insights. Plato's ideal forms might reflect the mindset of someone uncomfortable with the messiness of Athenian democracy. Kant's categorical imperative might emerge from a particularly Germanic approach to duty and order. But here's where Nietzsche's critique becomes constructive rather than merely destructive. He's not suggesting we abandon philosophical thinking. He's inviting us to become more honest and creative about it. Instead of pretending, we can step outside our human perspective to glimpse absolute truth. Why not embrace our humanity and see what insights emerge from that acknowledgement? Think about how this applies to your own life. How many of your strongest convictions are really just inherited assumptions dressed up as personal insights? How much of what you consider obviously true might simply reflect where and when you happen to be born? This isn't meant to make you cynical. It's meant to make you curious. When we stop defending our perspectives as universal truths, we become free to explore them as creative possibilities. Consider modern examples of this philosophical prejudice in action. When tech entrepreneurs claim their platforms will inevitably make the world more connected and democratic, they're often unconsciously universalizing their own Silicon Valley experiences and values. When economists build models assuming rational actors, they're frequently projecting their own analytical temperaments onto all of humanity. When self-help gurus promise universal principles for success, They're usually generalizing from their particular cultural context. Nietzsche's point isn't that these perspectives are worthless. It's that they become dangerous when they forget their perspectives rather than revelations. The most creative and useful thinking often happens when we hold our ideas lightly, when we treat our insights as experiments rather than discoveries, when we remember that every philosophical system is ultimately a very human attempt to make sense of a fundamentally mysterious existence. As we prepare to dive deeper into Nietzsche's challenging ideas throughout this book, remember this foundational insight. The goal isn't to find the one true philosophy to rule them all. The goal is to become more thoughtful, more creative, more honest about the assumptions we bring to our thinking. In a world that often demands absolute certainty, Nietzsche offers us something potentially more valuable: the courage to think freshly, to question deeply, and to create meaning rather than simply discover it. And perhaps, as we'll see in the chapters ahead, that's exactly the kind of philosophical courage our complex modern world desperately needs. Picture yourself sitting in a crowded coffee shop, watching the stream of people flowing past the window. Most move in predictable patterns, following the same routes, checking their phones at the same moments, ordering the same drinks they always order. But every now and then, someone walks by who seems different somehow. They pause to examine something others ignore. They take an unexpected path. They seem to be seeing the world through entirely different eyes. Nietzsche would call this rare individual a free spirit. And in Beyond Good and Evil, he paints a fascinating portrait of what it means to think independently in a world that desperately wants us to conform. Now, think about this for a moment. What does it actually mean to be a free spirit? We toss this phrase around casually today, usually describing someone who's a bit unconventional or marches to their own drummer. But Nietzsche had something far more profound and challenging in mind. For him, the free spirit isn't just someone who wears quirky clothes or has unusual hobbies. The free spirit is someone who has fundamentally questioned the very foundations of how we think about truth, morality, and meaning itself. Imagine you've spent your entire life believing that the map you're using to navigate the world is perfectly accurate, only to discover one day that it's riddled with errors, outdated information, and places that don't actually exist. That's the kind of disorienting experience Nietzsche describes when someone begins to develop into a free spirit. They start to see that many of the beliefs, values, and assumptions that guide most people's lives are actually inherited prejudices disguised as eternal truths. The journey toward becoming a free spirit begins with what Nietzsche calls a kind of spiritual nomadism. Just as a nomad doesn't settle permanently in any one place, the free spirit doesn't settle permanently into any fixed system of beliefs. They're constantly moving, questioning, experimenting with different perspectives. This sounds liberating, and in many ways it is, but Nietzsche is honest about the profound loneliness and difficulty that comes with this path. Consider how isolating it can be in our own time to question widely accepted beliefs. Think about someone who genuinely questions whether the career path everyone expects them to follow is actually meaningful, or someone who wonders whether the political positions their community takes for granted actually make sense. Even today, with all our talk about individualism and thinking for yourself, there's enormous social pressure to conform to certain ways of thinking. The free spirit experiences this isolation magnified tenfold, because they're questioning not just specific beliefs, but the very frameworks we use to determine what's true or valuable in the first place. Nietzsche uses a beautiful metaphor to describe this condition. He talks about free spirits as being like dancers who have learned to dance on thin ice. They've developed the ability to move gracefully across surfaces that would crack under the weight of more rigid conventional thinkers. But this agility comes at a cost. They can never fully rest, never completely trust that the ground beneath their feet is solid. They must remain perpetually light on their feet, ready to move when the ice begins to crack. What's particularly fascinating about Nietzsche's conception is how he sees the free spirit as both a destroyer and a creator. They tear down old certainties, but they also have the courage to experiment with new possibilities. Think about how this plays out in our contemporary world. The entrepreneurs who revolutionize entire industries are often free spirits in this sense. They see possibilities that others miss because they're not constrained by conventional wisdom about how things should work. But here's where it gets really interesting. Nietzsche argues that most people who think they're free spirits actually aren't. True free spirits are incredibly rare because the process of genuine intellectual liberation is far more difficult and dangerous than most people realize. It's one thing to reject your parents' religion or political views. It's quite another to question the basic categories through which you understand reality itself. The genuine free spirit, according to Nietzsche, has what he calls intellectual probity, a kind of ruthless honesty with themselves about their own motives, biases, and limitations. They don't just rebel against conventional thinking, they're equally suspicious of their own rebellious impulses. Are they questioning this belief because they've genuinely thought it through, or simply because questioning it makes them feel superior or different? This intellectual honesty extends to recognizing the provisional nature of their own insights. Unlike dogmatists who cling to their beliefs with fierce certainty, free spirits hold their own ideas lightly, always ready to revise or abandon them when they encounter better evidence or arguments. It's like being a scientist of your own life, constantly running experiments with different ways of thinking and being. Now you might be wondering, if being a free spirit is so challenging and isolating, why would anyone choose this path? Nietzsche suggests that, for certain rare individuals, it's not really a choice at all. They're driven by an irrepressible curiosity, a need to understand and explore that's stronger than their need for comfort or belonging. They're like intellectual explorers who can't resist venturing into uncharted territory, even when they know the journey will be difficult and the destination uncertain. But perhaps most importantly, Nietzsche sees free spirits as essential for the health and vitality of human culture. They serve as scouts, venturing ahead to test new ideas and possibilities that might eventually benefit everyone. Without free spirits, society would stagnate, trapped in outdated ways of thinking that no longer serve our evolving needs and circumstances. As we navigate our own rapidly changing world, filled with new technologies, social challenges, and possibilities that previous generations couldn't have imagined, Nietzsche's portrait of the free spirit feels remarkably relevant. We need people who can think beyond the conventional frameworks, who can question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, who can dance gracefully on the thin ice of uncertainty, while the rest of us are still looking for solid ground. The question isn't whether you'll become a free spirit in Nietzsche's demanding sense. Few ever do. The question is whether you'll have the courage to take even a few steps in that direction, to question a few more assumptions, to hold your own beliefs a little more lightly, to remain curious about possibilities you haven't yet considered. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop, watching people walk by, each carrying their own invisible bundle of beliefs, moral codes, and certainties about right and wrong. Some clutch their bundles tightly, others seem to drag them along reluctantly, and a few appear to have set theirs down entirely. This is exactly the scene Nietzsche invites us to examine when he turns his philosophical microscope toward what he calls the religious mood, and its profound impact on how we understand morality. Now, before you think this is going to be some heavy-handed attack on faith, let me pour you another cup of coffee and explain what Nietzsche is really after here. He's not simply dismissing religious belief as nonsense. Instead, he's doing something far more nuanced and, frankly, more dangerous to our comfortable assumptions. He's asking us to examine how religious thinking has shaped our entire moral landscape, often in ways we don't even recognize. Think about this for a moment. When you feel guilty about something, where does that feeling come from? When you instinctively know something is wrong, without being able to explain why, what's the source of that knowledge? Nietzsche suggests that even those of us who consider ourselves thoroughly secular are still walking around with moral furniture that was built in religious workshops centuries ago. He paints a fascinating picture of what he calls the religious mood, as a particular way of experiencing the world. It's characterized by a deep sense of dependency, a feeling that we are fundamentally flawed creatures in need of salvation, guidance, or redemption. This mood, Nietzsche argues, creates a specific type of person, one who looks outside themselves for moral authority, who sees suffering as potentially meaningful or purifying, and who divides the world into the sacred and the profane, the pure and the impure. Consider how this plays out in modern life. Even in our supposedly post-religious culture, we still see echoes of this religious mood everywhere. The way we talk about toxic people or behaviors, as if moral contamination were literally possible. The way we seek out gurus, life coaches, and self-help systems that promise to transform us from our current inadequate state into something better. The way we often approach politics with an almost religious fervor, complete with sacred texts, heretical thoughts, and the promise of a better world if only we follow the right doctrine. Nietzsche tells us a story that illuminates this perfectly. He describes meeting deeply religious people who seem to glow with inner peace and certainty. At first glance, you might envy them their serenity. But look closer, he suggests, and you'll notice something troubling. Their peace comes at the cost of a kind of spiritual dependency. They've traded the anxiety of having to figure things out for themselves for the comfort of having someone else do the thinking for them. Now, think about this in terms of moral development. Imagine a child who never learns to ride a bicycle because their parents always carry them everywhere. They might feel safe and cared for, but they never develop the muscles and balance needed to navigate on their own. Nietzsche argues that the religious mood can do something similar to our moral development. It can keep us in a state of perpetual childhood, always looking to external authorities to tell us what's right and wrong, never developing our own moral muscles. But here's where Nietzsche gets really interesting. He's not necessarily saying this is always bad. He recognizes that for many people, the religious mood provides genuine comfort, community, and meaning. The problem arises when this mood becomes so dominant that it prevents us from even imagining other ways of being moral, other sources of meaning and value. He uses a brilliant metaphor here. Imagine morality as a vast landscape, but the religious mood is like wearing colored glasses that only let you see certain parts of the terrain. You might navigate successfully within that visible area, but you'll never know what lies in the territories your glasses render invisible. What if there are forms of goodness, beauty, and meaning that can only be accessed by taking off those glasses, even if it means stumbling around in unfamiliar territory for a while? This connects to one of Nietzsche's most challenging insights about the relationship between religion and what he calls slave morality. He argues that religious thinking often encourages us to see strength, pride, and self-assertion as dangerous or sinful, while elevating weakness, humility, and self-denial as virtues. Again, he's not saying these latter qualities are bad, but he questions whether they should be our highest ideals. Think about how this plays out in contemporary culture. We often celebrate stories of people who sacrifice everything for others, who deny their own needs and desires for some greater good. These can be genuinely inspiring, but Nietzsche asks, what if our exclusive focus on such stories blinds us to other forms of human excellence? What about the person who creates something beautiful out of pure joy in their own power? What about the individual who refuses to apologize for their talents and achievements? The really unsettling part of Nietzsche's analysis is how it applies to those of us who think we've moved beyond religious thinking. He suggests that many supposedly secular moral systems are actually Christianity without the theology. We've kept the guilt, the self-denial, the suspicion of pride and power, but we've just found new secular justifications for these attitudes. Consider the modern phenomenon of virtue signaling, or the way people sometimes compete to demonstrate their moral purity on social media. Nietzsche might see this as the religious mood expressing itself in new forms, complete with confession, absolution, and the promise of moral superiority through proper belief and behavior. As we wrap up this exploration of the religious mood, Nietzsche leaves us with a provocative challenge. He's not asking us to abandon all moral standards or to become selfish monsters. Instead, he's inviting us to examine our moral beliefs with the same critical eye we might turn toward any other inherited tradition. Where do our deepest convictions about right and wrong come from? Which of these convictions serve life and human flourishing, and which might be holding us back from new forms of excellence and meaning? The question isn't whether we should be moral, but whether we have the courage to create morality anew, freed from both the comfort and the limitations of the religious mood that has shaped human consciousness for millennia. Picture this. You're sitting across from the most provocative dinner guest you've ever encountered, someone who drops philosophical bombs between sips of wine and somehow makes you question everything you thought you knew about morality, truth, and human nature. That's essentially what Nietzsche gives us in his collection of epigrams and interludes scattered throughout, beyond good and evil. These aren't just clever one-liners. They're concentrated doses of philosophical dynamite, each one designed to wake us up from what he saw as our moral slumber. Now, think about this for a moment. When was the last time a single sentence completely shifted your perspective on life? Nietzsche had a genius for crafting these verbal precision strikes that cut straight to the heart of our deepest assumptions. Take one of his most unsettling observations. He who fights monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. This isn't just about literal monsters, of course. We see this playing out everywhere in our modern world. Activists who become so consumed with fighting injustice that they adopt the very tactics they once opposed, or politicians who enter office to fight corruption only to become corrupted themselves. But here's where Nietzsche gets really interesting. He doesn't just point out these contradictions to be cynical. He's trying to show us something profound about human nature itself. Consider his observation that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Now, that might sound shocking at first, but think about it in today's context. How many people do you know who are so convinced of their own righteousness that they've become completely closed off to new information? Whether it's about politics, relationships, or even something as simple as the best way to make coffee, our convictions can become prison walls that keep us from growing and learning. Nietzsche understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. We humans are incredibly skilled at self-deception. He wrote, "The most common lie is that which one lies to oneself. Lying to others is relatively an exception." This hits differently when you consider how we curate our social media profiles, how we justify our bad habits, or how we explain away our failures while taking full credit for our successes. We're all walking around with carefully constructed narratives about who we are, and Nietzsche is that uncomfortable friend who points out the plot holes. One of the most powerful aspects of these aphorisms is how they reveal the complexity lurking beneath simple moral categories. Take his insight that there is master morality and slave morality. Now, before you dismiss this as elitist nonsense, consider what he's really getting at. Master morality, in his view, creates values from a position of strength and self-determination. Think of the entrepreneur who defines success on their own terms, or the artist who creates without worrying about market approval. Slave morality, on the other hand, defines itself in reaction to power. It's the morality of resentment, of defining good as whatever the powerful are not. You can see this dynamic playing out everywhere in contemporary culture. Social media has created entire ecosystems where people define their worth in opposition to others rather than from their own authentic values. The person who spends their day hate-watching content just to feel superior is living in what Nietzsche would recognize as slave morality. The person who creates something meaningful without needing external validation is operating from master morality. Neither is inherently better or worse. Nietzsche is simply pointing out that these are fundamentally different ways of approaching life. What makes these aphorisms so enduringly powerful is their ability to capture the paradoxes of human existence. Nietzsche writes, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs it is the rule." Think about how rational, intelligent people can get caught up in mass hysteria, whether it's financial bubbles, political movements, or even something as seemingly innocent as viral social media trends. The same person who carefully researches every purchase might enthusiastically share completely unverified information if it confirms their existing beliefs. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Nietzsche's aphorisms is how they force us to confront our own participation in what he saw as the decline of authentic thinking. He observed that the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. In our hyperconnected world, this struggle has become even more intense. We're constantly bombarded with other people's opinions, expectations, and judgments. The pressure to conform, whether to traditional values or to the latest progressive orthodoxy, can be overwhelming. Nietzsche's solution isn't to retreat from society but to develop what he called intellectual courage. He writes, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist." This isn't moral relativism. It's an invitation to think for ourselves rather than simply adopting prepackaged value systems. It's the difference between choosing your beliefs and having them chosen for you. What's remarkable about these philosophical fragments is how they anticipate so many of the psychological insights we've discovered in the past century. When Nietzsche writes about the will to power, he's describing what we might now call intrinsic motivation, the deep human need to feel effective and autonomous. When he talks about the eternal return, he's essentially asking us to live as if every choice we make will be repeated infinitely, a thought experiment that forces us to take full responsibility for our lives. As we move forward in our exploration of Nietzsche's revolutionary thinking, these aphorisms serve as guideposts, each one illuminating a different aspect of his larger project, helping us become who we truly are rather than who we think we should be. They're not meant to provide easy answers but to provoke better questions. In a world that often seems determined to reduce complex realities to simple slogans, Nietzsche's epigrams remind us that the most important truths are usually the most uncomfortable ones. They challenge us to embrace the difficulty of thinking for ourselves, even when, especially when, it means standing alone against the crowd. Picture yourself sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching the morning rush unfold outside the window. You see a businessman help an elderly woman with her groceries, a teenager give up their seat on the bus, and someone else walk past a homeless person without making eye contact. In those few moments, you've witnessed the entire spectrum of human morality in action. But here's the question that would have fascinated Nietzsche. Where did these moral impulses actually come from, and are they as natural and unchanging as we like to believe? This brings us to one of the most provocative sections of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche takes us on what he calls a natural history of morals. Now, when most people think about morality, they imagine it as something eternal, handed down from above, or discovered through reason like a mathematical theorem. But Nietzsche asks us to consider a radically different possibility. What if our moral systems are more like fashion trends than universal truths? What if they evolved, changed, and adapted based on very human, very practical needs? Think about this for a moment. We often talk about moral progress as if humanity has been climbing a ladder toward some perfect ethical system. But Nietzsche suggests we look at morality more like a biologist studying different species. Just as a penguin's flippers aren't better or worse than an eagle's wings, but rather perfectly adapted to different environments, different moral systems might be perfectly suited to different times, places, and peoples. Consider how dramatically our moral landscape has shifted just in the past century. Your great-grandmother might have believed that a woman's highest calling was domestic life, while today we celebrate female CEOs and astronauts. Was she wrong and are we right? Or are we both products of our particular historical moments, each with moral systems that serve their respective worlds? Nietzsche takes us even deeper into this rabbit hole. He argues that what we call morality often starts as something much more basic, the customs and habits that help particular groups survive and thrive. Imagine an ancient tribe where sharing food meant the difference between everyone surviving a harsh winter or half the group starving. Over generations, this practical necessity becomes a moral virtue. Generosity is good, they teach their children, not because they've reasoned their way to this conclusion, but because generous tribes survived while selfish ones perished. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once these survival strategies become moral principles, something fascinating happens. They start to take on a life of their own, becoming sacred and unquestionable. The original practical purpose gets forgotten, buried under layers of ritual and reverence. It's like a game of telephone played across centuries, where the final message bears little resemblance to the original. Now think about some of our own moral certainties. Take our belief in individual rights and personal freedom. These feel so fundamental, so obviously correct, that we can barely imagine thinking differently. But Nietzsche would remind us that, for most of human history, the group mattered far more than the individual. A medieval peasant would have found our obsession with personal fulfillment and self-expression not just foreign, but potentially dangerous to social order. This doesn't mean Nietzsche is advocating for moral relativism, where anything goes. Rather, he's suggesting something more nuanced and perhaps more unsettling. He's asking us to recognize that our moral systems are human creations, shaped by history, power, and circumstance. They're not discoveries of eternal truths, but inventions born from particular needs and perspectives. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. We live in societies built on democratic ideals, yet we often treat these ideals as if they're natural laws rather than relatively recent human innovations. Democracy, individual rights, equality before the law, these concepts would have seemed bizarre or even dangerous to most humans throughout history. Yet we've internalized them so completely that we struggle to imagine legitimate alternatives. Nietzsche uses the metaphor of a river to describe how moral systems develop. At the source, you might find clear, practical needs flowing like mountain springs. But as the river winds through valleys of tradition, culture, and power structures, it picks up sediment, changes course, and eventually becomes something quite different from its origins. The water that reaches the sea might be murky, powerful, and complex, bearing little resemblance to those crystal-clear mountain streams. This perspective has profound implications for how we think about moral disagreements. When we encounter people with radically different values, our instinct is often to assume they're either ignorant or evil. But what if they're simply products of different historical rivers? What if their moral systems evolved to solve different problems, to serve different environments? Take the ongoing debates about work-life balance. In many traditional societies, the idea that you should pursue personal happiness over family duty would seem not just selfish, but incomprehensible. Their moral system evolved around tight-knit communities where individual fulfillment was secondary to group survival and harmony. Our system evolved in societies where individual achievement and innovation drive progress and prosperity. Neither is inherently right or wrong. They're different solutions to different challenges. But here's where Nietzsche's analysis becomes both liberating and terrifying. If our moral systems are historical products rather than eternal truths, then they're also changeable. We're not bound by them forever. This opens up incredible possibilities for moral innovation and growth, but it also means we can't take our current values for granted. They require constant examination, defense, and conscious choice. As we sit here with our coffee, watching the world go by, we might ask ourselves, what moral assumptions am I carrying that future generations will find as strange, as we find medieval ideas about honor and hierarchy? What new moral challenges are emerging that our current systems aren't equipped to handle? How do we honor the wisdom embedded in our inherited values while remaining open to necessary change? This is the gift of Nietzsche's natural history of morals. It doesn't give us easy answers, but it gives us better questions. It reminds us that being human means being responsible for continuously creating and recreating the values we live by. And perhaps that's both the burden and the beauty of our human condition. Picture this. You're at a dinner party and someone mentions they're studying philosophy at university. Immediately, you might imagine them hunched over dusty books, speaking in complicated jargon, completely disconnected from the messy realities of everyday life. Well, my friend, you've just stumbled into one of Nietzsche's most biting observations about the academic world of his time, and frankly, one that feels remarkably relevant as we sip our coffee today. In this fascinating section called We Scholars, Nietzsche takes aim at what he sees as the fundamental problem with academic philosophers, those he calls scholars. Now, before you think he's just being mean-spirited, understand that Nietzsche himself was deeply embedded in academic life. He was a professor. He knew this world intimately, which makes his critique all the more powerful. It's like having an insider blow the whistle on their own profession. Think about this for a moment. What's the difference between someone who truly creates new ideas and someone who simply studies and categorizes existing ones? Nietzsche argues that most academic philosophers have become glorified librarians of thought rather than genuine thinkers. They're incredibly skilled at analyzing, comparing, and organizing the ideas of others, but they've lost the ability to create something genuinely new and transformative. Imagine a master chef versus a food critic. The critic can tell you everything about flavor profiles, cooking techniques, and culinary history. They can write eloquent reviews and make sophisticated comparisons between different dishes. But can they actually create a meal that moves people to tears? Can they innovate in the kitchen? Nietzsche suggests that academic philosophers have become the food critics of ideas, endlessly analyzing the recipes of great thinkers without ever stepping into the kitchen themselves. This critique hits particularly hard when we consider how universities operate today. Think about the pressure on academics to publish papers, to cite other scholars, to fit their ideas into established frameworks and methodologies. How often do we see truly revolutionary thinking emerge from academic institutions? More often, we see careful, incremental additions to existing knowledge, like adding another brick to an already towering wall rather than questioning whether we need the wall at all. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes even more interesting. He argues that scholars suffer from what we might call the paralysis of perspective. They've become so good at seeing all sides of every argument, so skilled at understanding multiple viewpoints, that they've lost the ability to take a firm stance on anything. It's like being a perpetual tourist in the land of ideas, always observing, never truly inhabiting. Now think about this in our current context. How many times have you encountered someone who can brilliantly explain the pros and cons of every political position, every philosophical stance, every life choice, but seems incapable of making a decision or taking action? They've become what Nietzsche might call objective, to the point of ineffectiveness. They pride themselves on their neutrality, but Nietzsche asks, is this neutrality actually a form of cowardice? Consider how this plays out in our modern world of endless information and analysis. We have more access to knowledge, more perspectives, more data than any generation in human history. Yet how many people feel paralyzed by choice, overwhelmed by information, unable to commit to a path forward? The scholar's disease has spread beyond academia into our everyday lives. Nietzsche tells us that true philosophers, the kind he admires, are not neutral observers but active creators of values. They don't just study existing moral systems, they have the courage to propose new ones. They don't just analyze culture, they shape it. Think of the difference between someone who studies leadership and someone who actually leads, between someone who analyzes art and someone who creates it. But here's a crucial nuance that makes this critique so compelling. Nietzsche isn't anti-intellectual or anti-education. He's not saying scholarship is worthless. Rather, he's pointing out that scholarship without the courage to create, to take risks, to make bold claims about how we should live, becomes a kind of intellectual masturbation, satisfying to the practitioner but ultimately sterile. This connects to something we see all the time in our professional lives. How many meetings have you sat through where everyone analyzed a problem to death, but no one was willing to make a decision? How many times have you seen analysis paralysis prevent action? The scholar's mindset can be incredibly valuable for understanding complexity, but it becomes problematic when it prevents us from ever moving forward. What makes this particularly relevant today is how our education system often rewards scholarly thinking over creative risk-taking. Students learn to give teachers the right answers rather than developing the confidence to propose their own solutions. They become experts at test-taking and essay writing, but struggle with the messy, uncertain work of actually creating something new in the world. Nietzsche suggests that true wisdom requires what he calls intellectual probity, a kind of honest reckoning with our own limitations and biases. But he argues that scholars often mistake their comprehensive knowledge for wisdom, their ability to see all sides for genuine understanding. It's like confusing having a detailed map with actually knowing the territory. So what's the practical takeaway from all this philosophical coffee talk? Nietzsche is challenging us to examine our own relationship with knowledge and action. Are we using our education and analysis as tools for creating something meaningful? Or are we hiding behind them to avoid the vulnerability of putting our own ideas on the line? The next time you find yourself endlessly researching before making a decision, or constantly seeking more information before taking action, remember Nietzsche's scholars. Sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is stop analyzing and start creating. Sometimes wisdom means having the courage to be wrong rather than the safety of never committing to being right. As we transition from this critique of scholarly detachment, we're about to explore how Nietzsche envisions a different kind of thinker altogether, one who doesn't just study life, but actively shapes it through the bold creation of new values and perspectives. Picture this. You're sitting across from a friend who's just returned from a long journey, and they're telling you about all the strange customs they witnessed in foreign lands. That's exactly what Nietzsche does in this fascinating section called Our Virtues. Except the foreign land he's describing is our own modern world, and the strange customs are the moral values we've come to accept without question. You know that feeling when you're at a dinner party and someone starts talking about how charitable they are, how much they care about equality, how deeply they value compassion. There's something in their tone that makes you wonder if they're trying to convince you or themselves. Nietzsche would have recognized that feeling immediately, because he spent considerable time examining what he called the virtues of his era, and what he discovered might surprise you. Think about the word virtue for a moment. We use it so casually, don't we? We talk about virtuous people, virtuous actions, virtuous causes. But when Nietzsche looked at the virtues that his contemporaries praised most highly, he noticed something peculiar. These weren't the bold, life-affirming qualities that had driven human excellence in other eras. Instead, they seemed designed to make life smaller, safer, more manageable. Consider how we talk about compassion today. It's universally praised, and rightfully so in many cases. But Nietzsche asked a provocative question. What if our obsession with compassion is actually a form of weakness masquerading as strength? What if it's become a way of avoiding the hard work of actually improving the world? Now, before you bristle at this suggestion, think about it practically. How often have you seen someone post about their compassion on social media while doing nothing concrete to help? How often does our culture mistake feeling bad about suffering for actually alleviating it? Nietzsche wasn't arguing against genuine compassion, but rather against what he saw as a kind of performative virtue that made people feel good about themselves without requiring any real sacrifice or growth. He observed that many of the virtues his society celebrated were actually what he called herd virtues, qualities that kept everyone moving in the same direction, thinking the same thoughts, avoiding anything that might rock the boat. Take the modern obsession with equality, for instance. On its face, it seems obviously good, doesn't it? But Nietzsche noticed that the drive for equality often came from resentment rather than genuine care for others. He saw people who couldn't excel themselves demanding that no one else be allowed to excel either. It's like a runner who can't win the race insisting that everyone should walk instead. The virtue of equality, he suggested, sometimes masks a deep hostility toward excellence itself. This insight feels startlingly relevant when you look at contemporary culture. Think about how often we see tall poppies getting cut down, how suspicious we've become of anyone who stands out or achieves something remarkable. We've created entire industries devoted to finding flaws in our heroes, as if their excellence somehow diminishes us rather than inspiring us. But here's where Nietzsche's analysis gets really interesting. He wasn't simply criticizing these virtues to tear them down. He was trying to understand where they came from and what purpose they served. He realized that what we call virtues are often just the qualities that a particular society needs to function smoothly. The virtues of a warrior culture are different from the virtues of a merchant culture, which are different from the virtues of an industrial society. Our modern virtues, he argued, are perfectly suited to a world that values safety, predictability, and mass cooperation. Qualities like humility, self-sacrifice, and conformity help maintain social order. But what happens when those same qualities start to stifle the very human capacities that could lead to genuine flourishing? Imagine a garden where every plant is carefully pruned to be exactly the same height. It might look neat and orderly, but you'd never see the magnificent oak that could tower above the rest, providing shade and shelter for countless other forms of life. Nietzsche worried that our virtues were creating a human garden where nothing was allowed to grow beyond a certain prescribed height. Now, think about this in your own life. How often do you find yourself apologizing for your successes, downplaying your achievements, or holding yourself back to avoid making others uncomfortable? These behaviors feel virtuous, don't they? They seem considerate and humble, but what if they're actually preventing you from becoming the fullest version of yourself, the version that could contribute something truly valuable to the world? Nietzsche wasn't advocating for selfishness or cruelty. Instead, he was calling for what he termed noble virtues, qualities that arise from strength rather than weakness, from abundance rather than scarcity. These might include courage, creativity, intellectual honesty, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. These virtues don't make life easier or more comfortable, but they make it more meaningful and more human. The practical wisdom here is profound. Before adopting any virtue or moral stance, Nietzsche suggests we ask ourselves some hard questions. Where does this virtue come from? Does it emerge from my strength or my weakness? Does it help me grow, or does it keep me small? Does it contribute to human flourishing, or does it just make me feel better about my limitations? This kind of moral self-examination isn't comfortable. It's much easier to adopt the ready-made virtues that society hands us, to feel good about checking all the right boxes. But Nietzsche believed that real virtue, the kind that actually makes the world better, requires us to think for ourselves, to take responsibility for our own values, and to have the courage to live according to our deepest understanding rather than our social programming. As we move forward in our exploration of Nietzsche's radical ideas, keep this question in mind. What if the path to genuine goodness requires us to go beyond the simple categories of good and evil that we've inherited? What if true virtue is something we must discover and create for ourselves, rather than something we can simply adopt from others? The answers might transform not just how you think about morality, but how you think about what it means to live a truly human life. Picture yourself sitting in a bustling cafe in any major city today, and you'll notice something fascinating. At one table, someone speaks passionately about their cultural heritage while ordering food from 3 different countries. At another, a person waves their national flag on social media while living thousands of miles from their homeland. This beautiful contradiction would have absolutely delighted Friedrich Nietzsche, because in the section, Peoples and Fatherlands, from Beyond Good and Evil, he tackles one of humanity's most persistent puzzles. What does it really mean to belong somewhere? Now think about this for a moment. When someone asks you where you're from, how do you answer? Do you mention the city where you were born, the country on your passport, or perhaps the culture that shaped your values? Nietzsche suggests that our modern obsession with neat national boundaries and cultural identities is far more complicated and, frankly, more interesting than we usually admit. Nietzsche begins this exploration by observing something that feels remarkably relevant today. He notices that the very people who shout loudest about their national pride are often the ones who understand their own culture the least. It's like someone who claims to be a wine expert but has only ever tasted one vintage. They mistake familiarity for knowledge, proximity for understanding. Have you ever met someone who wraps themselves in their flag, but can barely explain what their country's values actually mean in practice? Nietzsche saw this phenomenon emerging in his own time, and he found it both amusing and deeply concerning. But here's where Nietzsche gets really interesting. Rather than dismissing nationalism entirely, he suggests that true cultural identity is something far more sophisticated than simple geography or bloodlines. Think of culture like a river. The water you see flowing past isn't the same water that was there yesterday, yet we still call it the same river. Similarly, what we consider German culture, French culture, or any culture is actually a constantly flowing stream of influences, adaptations, and transformations. Nietzsche uses the example of what he calls good Europeans to illustrate this point. These aren't people who reject their local identities, but rather individuals who have become so deeply educated in their own traditions that they can see beyond them. Imagine a master chef who knows French cuisine so intimately that they can innovate while still honoring the tradition. They haven't abandoned their culinary heritage. They've transcended its limitations while preserving its essence. This leads us to one of Nietzsche's most provocative insights about nationalism. He argues that the people who truly embody the best of their culture are often the ones who seem to betray it. Consider how many of history's greatest artists, writers, and thinkers were considered traitors or outcasts in their own time. Shakespeare borrowed freely from Italian stories. Beethoven revolutionized German music by incorporating influences from across Europe, and today's most authentically American musicians might blend jazz, blues, hip-hop, and influences from around the world. Now, think about how this applies to our current moment. We live in an age where you can order Korean tacos from a truck owned by a second-generation Mexican-American while listening to K-pop influenced by American hip-hop. Someone might feel deeply connected to their Irish roots while living in Australia and working for a Japanese company. Nietzsche would argue that this complexity isn't a problem to be solved, but a richness to be celebrated. But Nietzsche isn't naive about the darker side of cultural identity. He recognizes that the same forces that can create beautiful cultural fusion can also lead to what he calls cultural chauvinism. This happens when people use their heritage as a weapon rather than a gift. Think about how often cultural pride becomes a way of diminishing others rather than celebrating oneself. It's the difference between saying, "I love my grandmother's recipes," and saying, "Only people like us know how to really cook." Nietzsche offers a particularly sharp observation about what he calls the herd mentality in nationalism. He suggests that many people cling to national identity, not because they genuinely understand or embody their culture's values, but because it gives them a ready-made sense of superiority without requiring any personal achievement. It's like wearing a sports jersey and feeling personally victorious when the team wins, despite never having set foot on the field. The philosopher proposes instead what we might call earned belonging. This is the idea that true cultural citizenship comes not from accident of birth, but from deep engagement with the best that a culture has to offer. someone who has studied the philosophical traditions of their country, grappled with its history honestly, including its failures, and contributed something meaningful to its ongoing story, has a stronger claim to cultural identity than someone who simply happened to be born within certain borders. Here's where Nietzsche's thinking becomes especially relevant to our globalized world. He anticipates that the future will belong to what he calls cultural nomads, people who are so deeply rooted in their own traditions that they can appreciate and learn from others without losing themselves. These are individuals who might speak multiple languages, understand various cultural codes, and feel at home in different contexts while still maintaining a core sense of who they are. Consider how this plays out in our interconnected age. The most successful global leaders, artists, and innovators often embody this quality. They can navigate different cultural contexts while bringing their own unique perspective to each situation. They're not cultural chameleons who change completely based on their surroundings, but rather cultural translators who can find common ground while honoring differences. Nietzsche's ultimate vision in Peoples and Fatherlands is of a world where cultural identity becomes a source of strength rather than limitation, of curiosity rather than fear. He imagines people who love their own traditions so deeply that they want to share them generously and learn from others freely. It's a vision that feels both timeless and urgently needed as we navigate the complexities of belonging in an increasingly connected yet fragmented world. As we finish our coffee and prepare to step back into that bustling, multicultural cafe of modern life, we might ask ourselves, how can we honor where we come from while remaining open to where we're going? Picture yourself sitting in a grand European cafe in the 1880s, watching the world transform around you. The old aristocracies are crumbling, democracy is rising, and everyone seems to believe that equality is the highest virtue. Into this scene walks Friedrich Nietzsche, coffee cup in hand, ready to ask the most uncomfortable question of his era. What if our obsession with equality is actually making us smaller as human beings? This brings us to one of the most provocative sections of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche explores what he calls the truly noble spirit. Now, before you roll your eyes thinking this is some elitist manifesto about bloodlines and inherited titles, let me stop you right there. Nietzsche isn't talking about the kind of nobility you'd find in a dusty genealogy book or a period drama. He's talking about something far more radical and, frankly, far more threatening to comfortable assumptions about human nature. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you met someone who genuinely didn't care what others thought of them? Not in that performative, "I'm so rebellious" way that's actually just another form of seeking approval, but someone who operated from such an internal compass that external validation was genuinely irrelevant. That's the beginning of what Nietzsche calls nobility, and it's rarer than you might think. The noble spirit, as Nietzsche describes it, doesn't emerge from democratic voting or social consensus. It emerges from what he calls a pathos of distance, an ability to stand apart from the herd and create values rather than simply inherit them. Imagine a master artist who doesn't paint what sells or what critics praise, but who creates entirely new forms of beauty that others can't even recognize yet. This artist doesn't hate the crowd, but neither does she need their approval to know her work has value. Here's where it gets really interesting, and probably where many of us start feeling uncomfortable. Nietzsche argues that the noble spirit naturally creates hierarchies, not because they're power-hungry tyrants, but because they see distinctions that others miss. They recognize that not all ideas are equally valuable, not all efforts deserve the same praise, and not all people have developed their potential to the same degree. Consider the difference between a master chef and someone who can barely boil water. The democratic impulse says we should treat both equally, that everyone's culinary efforts deserve the same respect. But the noble spirit recognizes a genuine hierarchy of skill, dedication, and achievement. This doesn't mean the master chef is a better human being, but it does mean their culinary judgment carries more weight. The noble person sees these distinctions clearly and isn't afraid to acknowledge them. But here's what makes Nietzsche's concept so complex and fascinating. True nobility, in his view, actually creates more space for others to flourish, not less. Think of it like this. Imagine a jazz musician so masterful that their very presence elevates everyone else in the band. They don't diminish others by being excellent. They create a gravitational field of possibility that pulls everyone upward. This is what Nietzsche means when he talks about noble spirits as commanders and legislators. They don't rule through force, but through the magnetic pull of their own self-creation. The noble person, Nietzsche tells us, has what he calls reverence for oneself. This isn't narcissism or self-obsession. It's more like the reverence a gardener has for a rare orchid, careful attention, patient cultivation, and deep respect for the potential being nurtured. They treat their own development with the same seriousness that others might reserve for their career or their children. Now, think about our modern world for a moment. We live in an age of instant opinions, where everyone's thoughts on everything are immediately broadcast to the world. Social media has created a kind of democracy of attention, where the loudest voice often wins, regardless of wisdom or experience. Into this chaos, Nietzsche's noble spirit would move like a calm center in a storm, not trying to shout over the noise, but creating something so genuinely valuable that others naturally turn toward it. What would this look like practically? Perhaps it's the entrepreneur who builds a company based on their vision of what's possible, rather than what market research says people want. Maybe it's the teacher who develops entirely new ways of helping students learn, regardless of whether it fits current educational trends. Or it could be the friend who consistently offers genuine insight and support, not because they want to be liked, but because they've developed their capacity for understanding and care. The tragedy, as Nietzsche sees it, is that modern democratic culture actively discourages this kind of nobility. We've become so committed to the idea that everyone's opinion matters equally that we've lost the ability to recognize genuine wisdom or excellence. We've created what he calls a leveling culture where standing out in any meaningful way is seen as somehow unfair or elitist. But here's the paradox that makes this whole exploration so rich. Nietzsche isn't advocating for a return to traditional aristocracy or some kind of authoritarian system. The noble spirits he admires are often rebels against existing power structures. They're the ones who create new values precisely because they're not bound by what currently exists. They're aristocrats of the spirit, not of birth or wealth. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging insight in this entire section. True nobility requires suffering and struggle. The noble spirit isn't born from comfort and ease, but from wrestling with difficulties that would break lesser spirits. It's forged in the fire of genuine challenges, not manufactured in the comfort of privilege. Think of every great artist, thinker, or leader you admire. Chances are their nobility was earned through trials that revealed and strengthened their character. As we close this exploration of what Nietzsche means by nobility, we're left with questions that pierce right to the heart of how we want to live. Are we content to be shaped entirely by external forces, by social media algorithms, market pressures, and popular opinion? Or do we have the courage to develop our own internal compass and create value from our unique perspective? The choice, as Nietzsche would say, reveals everything about who we truly are and who we might become. Picture this. You're sitting in a cozy coffee shop, the kind where the barista knows your order by heart, and your friend across from you has just returned from a solo hiking trip that changed their perspective on everything. That's the feeling Nietzsche captures in From High Mountains, the poetic finale of Beyond Good and Evil. It's like he's descended from some philosophical peak, still catching his breath, ready to share what he discovered in the thin air of absolute solitude. Now think about this for a moment. When was the last time you were truly alone with your thoughts, not scrolling through your phone, not listening to a podcast, not even having background music playing? Just you, silence, and whatever emerges from that space. It's almost uncomfortable to consider, isn't it? We've become so accustomed to constant stimulation that genuine solitude feels foreign, even threatening. But Nietzsche understood something profound about this state that we're only beginning to rediscover in our hyperconnected age. In this section, Nietzsche writes like a mountaineer who has spent months in isolation, watching civilizations far below like ant colonies, gaining perspective that's impossible to achieve at ground level. He speaks of the great loneliness, not as something to be feared or cured, but as the necessary condition for genuine greatness. It's a radical idea that cuts against everything our social media culture tells us about the importance of being connected, liked, and constantly engaged. Consider the metaphor he's working with here. Mountains have always represented transcendence in human culture, from Moses receiving the commandments on Mount Sinai to the Buddhist concept of the mountain as a symbol of unchanging awareness. But Nietzsche's mountain isn't about receiving divine wisdom from above. It's about the clarity that comes from distance, the perspective that emerges when you step outside the valley of common opinion and conventional thinking. He writes about the great noon of life, that moment when shadows disappear because the sun is directly overhead. This isn't just poetic flourish, it's a psychological insight about peak experiences. Have you ever noticed how your most profound realizations often come not during intense discussions or while consuming information, but in those quiet moments when your mind has space to synthesize and create? Maybe it's during a long walk, or in the shower, or just before falling asleep. Nietzsche is pointing to something similar but magnified, the kind of clarity that emerges from extended periods of solitude and reflection. What's fascinating is how this connects to modern research on creativity and innovation. Studies consistently show that breakthrough thinking requires what psychologists call divergent thinking, which flourishes in unstructured, solitary environments. The greatest innovators, from Einstein to Steve Jobs, were notorious for their need for alone time, for walking and thinking without agenda. Nietzsche intuited this connection between solitude and creative greatness long before we had the neuroscience to explain why. But here's where Nietzsche gets really interesting. He's not advocating for hermit-like withdrawal from the world. The mountain metaphor works both ways. You climb up to gain perspective, but eventually, you must come back down. The insights gained in solitude are meant to be brought back to the valley, transformed into something that can benefit others. Think of it like a creative retreat. You might go away alone to write a novel or compose music, but the ultimate goal is to share that creation with the world. This creates a beautiful paradox that Nietzsche explores throughout this section. True connection with others, genuine contribution to human culture, often requires periods of disconnection. It's like the way a river needs to flow through empty spaces to gain power before it can turn the wheels of a mill. In our age of constant collaboration and team building, this insight feels almost subversive. When was the last time your workplace encouraged you to take significant time alone, to think deeply about a problem? Nietzsche also touches on something that resonates powerfully with anyone who has ever felt like an outsider or struggled with conventional expectations. He writes about the loneliness of having insights that others aren't ready to hear, of seeing possibilities that seem invisible to those around you. This isn't intellectual arrogance, though it can certainly become that. It's the natural result of thinking independently and following ideas to their logical conclusions, even when those conclusions are uncomfortable or unpopular. Consider how many of the ideas we now take for granted were once considered radical or even dangerous. Democracy, human rights, scientific method, artistic freedom. Each of these concepts required individuals willing to think beyond the accepted wisdom of their time, to endure the loneliness of being ahead of the curve. Nietzsche is celebrating this kind of intellectual courage while also acknowledging its emotional cost. The practical wisdom here is profound. In a world that constantly demands our attention and opinion, Nietzsche reminds us that sometimes the most valuable thing we can offer is the fruit of deep, solitary reflection. This doesn't mean becoming antisocial or dismissive of others' perspectives. Rather, it means cultivating the ability to step back, to create space for original thought, to resist the pressure to have immediate opinions about everything. Think about your own life for a moment. Where do your best ideas come from? Probably not from committee meetings or social media debates. More likely, they emerge during those quiet moments when your mind is free to wander and make unexpected connections. Nietzsche is urging us to protect and cultivate these spaces, to see solitude not as loneliness but as a form of intellectual and spiritual discipline. As we close this exploration of Nietzsche's mountaintop reflections, consider this. In a world that increasingly values speed over depth, connection over contemplation, perhaps the most radical act is simply taking time to think. Not to consume more information or engage in more debates, but to create space for the kind of deep reflection that can only happen in solitude. The mountain is always there, waiting for those brave enough to make the climb. The question is whether we're willing to leave the comfortable valley of constant stimulation for the challenging, but ultimately rewarding heights of genuine thought. Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil challenges traditional moral values and encourages readers to explore the depths of human nature beyond conventional dichotomies. It's a profound philosophical work that seeks to redefine the boundaries between good and evil, urging individuals to craft their own moral compass. Here are a few key takeaways from the book. 1. Question conventional morality *. Nietzsche encourages us to critically examine societal norms and question whether they truly serve our authentic selves. To apply this, start small by reflecting on one societal norm you follow without questioning and explore its personal significance. 2. Embrace the will to power. This concept suggests that life's driving force is not survival or reproduction, but a fundamental will to assert and enhance one's own existence. Begin by identifying a personal goal that excites you and take tiny, actionable steps towards it each day. 3. Cultivate your own values *. Nietzsche speaks of creating one's own values as an act of self-empowerment. Try jotting down what matters most to you as an individual and look for ways to incorporate these values into everyday decisions. 4. Recognize the complexity of truth *. Truth, according to Nietzsche, is multifaceted and subjective. Start by being patient with yourself and embracing ambiguity in situations where you feel unsure. Allow space for multiple perspectives. 5. Become who you are *. Nietzsche encourages self-discovery and authenticity. Reflect on your strengths and passions, and start incredibly small by dedicating a few minutes each day to something that aligns with them, nurturing your true self over time. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.